It's my great pleasure, my great honor to be able to interview Ernie Lowe today. I think that there's a lot of what Ernie does fits so well here at UC Merced, considering our students and our faculty and our sort of mission to aid the Central Valley in its mission, right, in the university's mission. So I wanted to set a couple of questions to ask Ernie sort of about the collection, about his life, about how he came to the Central Valley, and hopefully we can spark a really interesting discussion around art and activism and the kind of work that his photography in particular did. So I want to begin with just a little bit of background information. Ernie, can you tell us a little bit about, where you're from, where you were born, how you came to the Central Valley, and what led you to do the kind of work that you do?
Well, I grew up in Southern California as a third-generation native son. My mother had grown up on a cattle ranch in the Sierra foothills. My dad was an Okie who came out before the Dust Bowl. And so I had a strong interest in the culture of the Anglos in California. I started photographing in 1960 in the fields and the camps in the communities in up and down the San Joaquin Valley. I had heard a broadcast on KPFA, Pacifica Radio, where a little bit later I was working. Bard McAllister from the American Friends Service Committee, a very noted field agent doing wonderful community organizing. He was describing the conditions and saying, there's little change from what Dorothea Lange and Ben Shahn and other Farm Security Administration photographers had photographed in the valley. And I do wish that someone would come out and document what is happening now. And it just struck me immediately that this was something I wanted to do, something I must do. And I just started by making contact with the organizing effort of the American Friend of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And they would introduce me into camps and get me started. Then I would just go up and down the highways, the byways, come to a field and see people working, hop out of the car and start photographing.
You mentioned Dorothea Lange, Bard McAllister, some of these, and then the photographers of the Farm Services Administration. Can you tell me a little bit about your relationship with some of them, perhaps Dorothea? I often said that your work belongs in that same pantheon of the work of the FSA photographers and Dorothea Lange in particular. I wonder if there's sort of a personal connection there, or was it just sort of inspired by their work? How you got started in photography in particular versus any other kind of, sort of documentary work. I know you did some interviews, but what was it about, or is there something about that relationship that brought you to photography?
Well, I was studying documentary photography and filmmaking at the San Francisco Art Institute in 1958, 59. And Dorothea, at the time that she was just beginning to struggle with cancer, came and did a wonderful workshop with us. So I had that initial connection. And then after I'd photographed for a year, I asked if I could come visit and was able to sit down with her and show her some of my prints. And she, after looking at a couple dozen of them, she looks at me and says, "This is my family album." And I was so humbled by that. So it just brought tears to my eyes to be recognized that way. Then she asked if she could help in any way, and she would loan me a camera for some of my trips and give me a bit of money to help pay some of my film and paper developer costs, so forth.
Yeah, I imagine even then it was a pretty sort of capital intensive project of film, of capturing film and developing film and looking at negatives, etc. You mentioned, I think one of the things that has always struck me about your work, that I think separates you from many of the other photographers, especially photographers of migrant families, is just two things. One, I think, is the sort of quotidian aspect of their lives that you capture that isn't necessarily misery or oppression, but that captures the human spirit, that captures the resistance, captures the joy, the resiliency in a lot of these folks. And the other that I think separates a lot of the work that you do is that you were intent really on documenting the organized struggle, right? So the AWOC, the union meetings, the labor leaders. What accounted for that kind of activism within your work, right? What accounted for that lens that you had of those communities?
I grew up in the Depression. My parents, though, both had good jobs throughout. We had owned our home, so we were comfortably poor. And my dad had a big heart, and I think that there was something that I gained from him that gave me the compassion and the ability to go out and talk with people and very simply ask to take their pictures. Very, very seldom got turned down. And so that the activism, I think, came as much as anything from my dad and from my general interest in improving the world. And then that got focused in farm labor because the connection with the people was so deep. I'm working on a book of portraits now, about 60 pages of full-page portraits. I'm calling it Here I Am. And each portrait has this incredible, intense presence to it. Even photographing a wino sitting with a bottle under a water tank, he'd be looking out at me and acknowledging, here I am. And I may be drunk, but I'm gonna communicate to the world through your lens.
I think that's so amazing and powerful, and it's for a group of people that are often invisible and set aside and pushed aside and cast aside, and for your photography to be able to highlight their humanity and bring them to the forefront, I think is invaluable, and it's an invaluable work that you do. Can you describe a little bit sort of the environment that you were photographing in terms of the organizing environment that was happening? You were present for some really important meetings of AWOC's history. George Ballas was around, Maria Moreno, some really important organizing, sort of the early days of the UFW, or the transition from the AWOC to the UFW. Can you describe what that feeling was like, and what it was like, especially particularly here in the Central Valley, the kind of energy that you felt, the kind of movement that you saw happening around you?
Well, there were really two worlds there. One was the professionals running the organizing campaign, and most of them didn't really understand farm labor very well, and they give pretty pompous speeches, and there was hardly ever any open discussion. And then the AFL-CIO pulled out the money for organizing from AWOC, and Hank Anderson, who had been research director, organized a conference. And it was 2 days in Strathmore, just a wonderful active participation. The photos I took then, you know, when I look back at them now, they look as though they were really heroic images, and the people speaking from the floor. There's one in particular, a Latina standing with her baby in her arms and speaking out. You know, first kind of timidly and picking up her hand, raising her hand, and then speaking very strongly about the conditions that she and her husband worked under and how hard it was to feed their kid.
A lot of those photos are so, they feel so alive, right? You can feel the energy, you can feel like the hope, you can feel the frustration. I mean, they're incredibly powerful. I wonder, you know, if, because I know you recorded some of those meetings as well, but I feel like somehow the photos do more work than the recordings. Like, it's just like hearing somebody like Maria Moreno's voice and then seeing her, it's inspiring, really. I wanted to shift gears just a little bit because I know that you also write poetry. I know that you're also, you know, expressing, you know, sort of a lot of the emotion and thought that you have about these issues in poetry as well. I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about what that process is like, whether you take inspiration from your own photos or whether your poetry is, you know, doing some other kind of work.
I did not write many poems about the farm labor scene, but I was continually writing poems, you know, calling for social justice, economic justice, and calling out the robber barons of our country, often connecting, you know, to the details in my own life, the place where I would be living, and going back and forth between what I was experiencing very directly and what I experienced through reading periodicals like The Nation and The New Republic, The Progressive, I Have Stoned Weekly. So I did write a poem on Teviston, exploring the origin of the name. There was a fellow named Lloyd Tevis who had this enormous landholding in the valley. And I tried to find any signs of him being remembered. And Teviston, this poor Black community on Highway 99, is the only memorial to Lloyd Tevis, this great landowner who would take a day to ride across his possessions.
I think that serves as a really good transition here, because I was going to ask you about the Teviston photos, but more importantly, I think, well, I should say for the audience is unaware that a few years ago, the Fresno Historical Society staged an exhibit of yours photos entitled The Black Okies that focused on the community of Teviston. And I encourage all of you to go back and look at that collection. What I wanted to ask about, though, was that in 2015, you returned to Teviston with a lot of those photos. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that trip was like and some of the folks you met and, you know, their reactions to the photos that you had. And I know that you learned a lot about some of the folks that you photographed as well. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that got started when I got a call from Marco Rax, the great Valley journalist, saying that he was producing a film and he just learned that on Teviston, and he just learned that there was this historical archive that I had recorded. I'd done both voice recordings and many documentary photos in Teviston throughout the time in the 60s I was working. And he invited me to come down and explore and see if we could find any of the people I'd photographed. So we went to a church in Teviston. I think it was in Pixley, right near Teviston, Pixley First Baptist. And after the service, we laid out photographs from the 60s. And people just started going, oh my God, that's Bertha Jean. Oh, that's Bertha May. That's Benjamin. And oh, that's me there. That's me there. 12 years old, 3 years old, whatever. And taking pictures of the pictures and just going back and forth, all thrilled with seeing that. And we had that same experience in South Dos Palos, where I just spent maybe a couple of hours taking pictures, but very memorable pictures.
Yeah, I imagine it had a little bit of a kind of family reunion feel to it, right? Folks that they hadn't seen other, relatives or friends in those photos in a long time. So I imagine it.
And then I was able to take new pictures of them and also find out about what had happened with them in their lives. And there was no one still working in farm labor. They'd gotten out. They had parents who would encourage the kids. So none were working in real fancy jobs, but they had good service jobs and were living in good homes and very, very strong family connections.
I think we're gonna turn to the audience here for a few minutes and ask some of the questions that have been that are coming up in the Q&A. I'm hardly a photographer, let alone know anything about the technical process, but we have a question here that does speak to that asks you to describe your composition process.
That's a hard question because it came so naturally to me. I didn't, there wasn't a consciousness to it. It's like I would aim my camera and just naturally find a composition that 8 times out of 10 would really be a good composition. And working with people, particularly people in action, I would take quite a few pictures as quickly as one could. I did most of my shooting with 2 1/4 twin lens reflex. So I'd be changing rolls of film very often out in the field. And just, it was such an enjoyable process. I was so present to what was happening and never taking pictures of someone without their permission, unless it was a more distant scene. And like I said, with the portraits, I'd always ask if I could take a portrait. And time after time, people were there. And there was something that it fed me. It gave me a deep sense of connection that often I would have difficulty having without a camera in my hand. I was a very shy person, but once I had the camera, I got out there, that gave me permission to be there myself.
Interesting. As a kind of a follow-up for that, what led to the decision of, again, because this was to take pictures inside people's homes, and what was their reaction to being inside their homes?
Uh, Generally, there would be a welcoming. There would be a sense that this could make a difference. They, you know, in one case, I met a number of blacks standing out on a street corner. One of them, after we chatted a while, took a few pictures. One said, "Come with me. I want you to see how we're living." And he very freely let me take pictures of his child in bed, of his child in his mother's arms, the grandmother with them. And there was never a sense of shame. It was simply, this is the way it is. And we want people to know the way it is. We're living a tough life.
We have another question from the audience that says, how does it feel to be in the same room as those organizing and know that you're an important part of the movement for social justice?
Well, at that Strathmore conference, before it began, I hung my photos all around the walls of the conference. And the people could see that what I was doing in the conference was just part of my whole project. And there was a great deal of respect paid to me by the folks. And it was really thrilling to be there, as I said before, and to be a part of it, and to do a full recording and then edit that into a show on KPFA. Because all the time I was working at KPFA and coming back and doing shows periodically. The first one, I'm demonstrating it. At that point, I didn't feel articulate. And so I would cut myself out and put together montages of just the voices of farm workers. It took several years before I felt confident to do some narration. But the first show was called Sometimes You Work a Day, based on a quote, sometimes you work a day, sometimes you don't get nothing. If you don't get nothing, you just get home and you're hungry. So I still feel the photos, I still feel the recordings. There are voices that are just embedded in my heart.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, I mean, I feel it, you know, I feel when I see it, I feel when I hear the recordings, and I think that's a testament to your skill, to your heart coming through in your work.
I did a biography, an autobiography recording, some oral history with a fellow in Teviston named William McKinley Buck Ashmore. And there was something I didn't hear as he was speaking. I only heard it later when I was editing the tapes for broadcast. And he said this wonderful thing. He said, well, as my mother used to say to me, there's nothing goes over the devil's back that don't buckle under his belly. Years later, I looked at that and said, oh, that's karma. That's what you do comes back on you. And he just said it so beautifully.
We have another question from the audience asking, which photographs were your hardest ones to take?
I would say early on, I visited Teviston, and it was Valley Fog Day. That absolutely chilling wet fog, and little kids were out playing, no real coats on, just looking, really pained by being there, but still playing with each other and doing their best to enjoy themselves. And I think those were some of the hardest photos, because they just look so sad.
So we have a question also. Do you have any advice for artists today who are working in support of activist communities or social movements?
There are so many artists doing that now. I think the greatest thing to do is to just dive into the web and find the photos that are now being taken. I think the tradition of documentary photography, among other things, is now in the hands of people living that life. And there are younger photographers who are able to get a camera good enough to do good documentary photography. And there are people like David Bacon, who has been documenting the life in the fields and camps and the organizing efforts ever since he went to work as a young man with Cesar Chavez as an organizer. So I think the best advice is to pay attention to what is happening and to go out with a sense of humility, to not be afraid to be there, and to not hide behind the camera, but to use the camera as a way of connecting.
How has your own development as an artist been affected by those around you? Either other art firms, other photographers. Obviously, growing, being in the middle of the farm worker movement, the civil rights movement, there was all kinds of different artistic and cultural production that was happening at the time. Not only how they influence you, but sort of where do you think you fit in?
Let's see. At the time, the one photographer I had good connection with was George Ballas. It was, very easy to find him since he was very public presence as the editor of the Valley Labor Journal. And so I got acquainted, and often I'd stay at his house when I was out photographing. Sometimes I'd stay in camps, and sometimes I'd stay at my parents' up in the Sierra foothills. But I really had a good time just hanging out with George and talking about the scene, and he'd point out places that I should go take pictures, like Three Rocks, a notorious camp that kind of a grifter developer. He bought some land. He moved houses, shacks that had been condemned by the county on growers' land, moved them to his land, and then he only charged rent for the land because he couldn't possibly charge rent for the buildings. And finally, that was closed down by the county a few years after I took pictures there. Some of my most moving photographs were there. There was one Chicana woman that let me come into her house after greeting me with a very suspicious look, that we talked a while. And later, people would look at the pictures I took and said, "She was such a good housekeeper. Look at that floor, it's so clean." Old splintery boards that it looked immaculate. The kitchen is so beautiful, and there was a shrine on the wall. It's a beautiful Catholic shrine. That's one of my favorite pictures. just talking about it, I feel very deeply moved. Remember that.
What do you think about sort of, I know before we got online, we were talking a little bit about photography today and the kind of, equipment that you use today and the kind of, I think about Photoshop and, all these other things, Adobe, and that sort of can, alter photos after the fact. And I wonder what you think about kind of the integrity of the photos that are taken at the time and what they, whether they're, maybe we're losing some of that with kind of the technology available today.
Well, for me, the really important thing is that I have so much flexibility in working with my scans. A lot of my negatives had issues. I would always, when I was shooting inside, I would always shoot with natural light. I couldn't stand using a flash because it was so intrusive. And I could hold a camera and shoot it 1/10, 1/15 of a second and get a good image. But some of them need sharpening. A lot of them need balancing and bringing out the detail and shadows and all that. So I'm able to really get images that reflect my intention rather than my technical skill at that time. I have never, how should I put it? I've had a very strong sense of integrity in how I use the photos. There are some photos that, the snotty-nosed kid kind of photo that I just wouldn't use because it was demeaning to the kids. They couldn't help it that it was a cold day and they didn't have anything to blow their nose in.
Can you tell me a little bit about your decision to place your collection at UC Merced and what that means to you and what you think it might mean for the Valley?
Oh, I can't imagine a better place for the pictures, particularly after the two visits to campus. And seeing the diversity, seeing the racial and ethnic diversity, seeing the spirit of the kids, the young people. Kids are such a poor term. And they're, how hard some of them were working to adapt because they had no one in their family who'd ever been to college. First ones. And I was able to speak to several different classes. And each time the questions, the discussion, the feeling of the students was really, really very moving to me. So I think that having my photos in the digital collection of UC Merced Library is a very appropriate thing. And then visiting Calisphere and seeing those thousands of images online and being able to zoom in. There'd be a picture of a pantry with the government surplus food on the shelf, and I could zoom in and read the label of the package of lard or whatever. So I think the presence on Calisphere is just amazing, and the fact that people can view them, can use them in academic books, can use them in student reports, whatever. I'm very, very proud of that.
Yeah, I'm excited because, as you know, Teviston or South Dos Palos or East Porterville, there's all these communities up and down the valley that have not really had their stories told in any consistent form. And I think, these photos, even if there aren't necessarily photos of places like East Porterville or wherever else, you can see East Porterville in South Dos Palos or in Teviston or in these other sort of unincorporated communities, these communities of color that are all over the valley. And so I think they have the potential to really serve as inspiration if they're not directly related to people's research, that serve as inspiration and say, hey, these communities existed, they have a history, they've been there, and maybe Ernie didn't photograph your particular community, but you can do that research and find those photos and find that history, and really sort of bring it out, and contribute in that way. I echo everything that you say about our students having been there for 11 or 12 years now. It's a remarkable place. I've never taught anywhere like it. I doubt that I will ever teach anywhere like this. And I'm a huge fan, and we're really grateful that we're able to acquire the collection and that we're able to share your work, and give you this platform to really highlight the work that you've done for the Valley. We have a couple more sort of technical questions. One about your kind of favorite cameras. What are your favorite cameras?
Back in the day, I had a Mamiya Flex twin lens that theoretically had interchangeable lenses, but I couldn't afford more than a standard lens for it. And I had a used Nikon S1, the very first Nikon 35 high quality, attempting to be as good as Leica. And then Dorothea Lange would loan me her contacts sometime to have a second camera for telephoto lens, so forth.
Next question we have is, was there anything that you needed to unlearn from your formal art training to do the work that you did?
My formal art training was with the Farm Security Administration photographer, John Collier. And he was very much encouraging me to follow the tradition and giving me very good feedback. So there was nothing to unlearn from him.
Can you tell the audience a little bit more about John Collier?
Unfortunately, the most vivid memory is that he and my wife had shared the same surgeon for an experimental back surgery for disc damage. And so a great deal of our time together was visiting and comparing hospital stories. and that's what I remember most. And I don't remember, yeah, the academic setting was very much just go out and shoot and come back and show me the pictures and I'll give you my feedback and here's what you could have done, kind of thing. So that was about the way that was.
So you felt like there was always like strong support for the kind of work that you did, right? And you had a pretty robust network of people who were supportive of the work that you did.
Well, that brings to mind a story of non-support that I think was a dramatic one. After four years of visits out to the valley, I went to the Dion Museum, and there was no photography curator. I went directly to the director of the museum, a guy named McGregor. And he loved my photos and said, I would really welcome your producing an exhibition. I'll give you a budget to help you with the expenses. And I just went to work printing probably 500 images to get something to choose from, and checking in with them periodically. Everything was going well. I had a couple of wonderful architects who helped me design a multimedia exhibition. And then I think it was about a month before the exhibition was to go on the walls, I get a letter from him saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm just heartbroken. The board of directors has instructed me to cancel the show. It is too controversial and they see it as propaganda." And being an activist, and in touch with a great network of activists in the community through my work at KPFA, I brainstormed and came up with the idea of proposing to the board that I would be doing a citywide storefront exhibition, the show that the Young Museum censored. And fortunately, I had one of my good KPFA connections, Father Eugene J. Boyle, who was in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and was probably had some of these board members as his members of his communion. He let them know that there was this risk to the reputation of the museum, and instantly the show was back on the schedule.
That's a great story. And I think what it really, I think, should impart to our audience is that you have to have community, right? You have to have a community of people who can share, who can brainstorm, who can, help you find these other ways to these other avenues around power, right? Because power is always going to try to censor or quiet or shuffle off this kind of work. And if you don't have a group of people to turn to help with, to help you brainstorm, to circumvent those channels, it can be very lonely. It can be a very lonely experience. And so I think that's such a great story, and it really shows the kind of the power of community and sharing. Yeah, I'm always marveled at the group of activists and artists and photographers that came out of that era, and the kind of work that you all did together. What are some of your kind of fondest recollections of some of those times, of those kinds of stories?
What comes to mind immediately isn't a direct answer. I would often, when my wife needed some alone time, I would take my daughter Martha to the darkroom with me, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, through those years. And she'd kind of help me, and she'd hang out. And later she majored in photography when she went to college, because she had such fond memories of that warm, dark light of the darkroom. So that was my immediate community. And then I had a friend at KPFA who was a volunteer, very good announcer and general volunteer, and she would spend a lot of time both in the darkroom with me, and she was the wife of Hank Anderson. That's how I met and got involved in the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And then I would also spend quite a bit of time with Hank, because he just knew so much about the economics of farm labor and the economics of the farm industry in the valley. So,
that brings up another interesting question I have, or interesting dilemma. I think, you know, the arts have been sort of systematically cut, and opportunities for art education and art training have been systematically cut. I imagine that there are many students out there who would have wanted to or would like to major in photography, but are told that it's not viable, or told that it's, you know, a hobby, or for whatever other reason are told that it's not something they should be pursuing. What do you say to those kind of suggestions to students that they shouldn't be wasting their time on something like that if it's not a viable profession?
well, it's a world with there's a magazine and website, socialdocumentary.net, and there are great photographers all around the world now. In every poor country of the world, there are great photographers. They're sometimes not working with the best equipment, but working with an eye and a heart that is really right. And I think that anyone who wants to come into photography needs to begin with the love, the passion for being a documentarian, for being someone who is reporting on some facet of the world that needs attention. And I don't think I ever paid for my expenses until much later, when I was able to earn a bit more money from the photos. And when UC Merced made that very fortunate purchase. But I was there with my passion, with my love of the medium, with my love of the people I was photographing. And that was my compensation.
Do you ever worry that with the proliferation of photography and cell phones and cameras and things like that, that the images don't have the same kind of impact that they had 30 or 40 years ago, that we've become in some ways desensitized to people's suffering or humanity, even because of the proliferation or, you know, of media, or sort of this constant bombardment of some really terrible, you know, images or videos, etc.
Mm-hmm. Look at what that one woman did for the whole world when she photographed the death of George Floyd. Just with her cell phone, she captured a brutal murder, and we have finally obtained a degree of justice in the conviction. Can't even refuse to remember the guy's name, Chauvin. So I think that we're getting a flood of images, but there are images that count. And it's possible now to experience what is happening in our world. I look at The Guardian most mornings, and they do a photo gallery every morning, photos from around the world, many of them by people who are not professional photographers. I look at the National Geographic, which has transformed from the National Geographic of my childhood to being a channel for documentary photography beyond the nature and ethnic life realm. So the photos count, and my screensaver is photos I save from the internet. Every day I may see something I toss in there, and it will move from a woman. One image just burnt into my mind. A woman's in a long gown, standing face to face with a squad of tax squad cops, and something like that is so deep in its communication. So yes, we have a proliferation of images, and if you spend too much time on Facebook, you see nothing but birthday parties and puppy dogs, but other people like Joe Naguib keep posting images that matter.
I love that idea that you say some images just matter, and they just matter more. And I love that idea. I wonder if you could speak to this notion of objectivity and the idea that photographers and journalists are supposed to maintain some sort of objectivity. I wonder what your idea about that is.
Well, the Guardian is a strong answer. The Guardian started covering police murders at least 4 years ago, and for a long time, there was one page on the Guardian where you could go and see the thousands of murders in the U.S. that had happened. So I think objectivity is saying what is happening.
So we have a few more minutes for a couple more questions from if we have anything from the audience. But if there's anything that you'd like to leave us with, Ernie, about that you'd like to tell the audience in terms of, messages or ideas or hopes or dreams or whatever else it might be.
Oh, well, I want to come back to UC Merced and assuming that we're finally beginning to wind down on COVID or even do it virtually, that masterclass we talked about. I would love to be able to work with a set of people who are relatively new to documentary photography and want to hone their skills and bring their heart out.
Yeah, I think that's something that we would love for to happen. I know we were trying to get some movement on it before the pandemic, and hopefully we'll be all in person, in the near future. So just let me close by saying again, what a pleasure it's been getting to know you over the last couple of years, acquired during the collection. What it means to us, what it means to the students, what it means to the community at large. I really hope that you feel the gratitude that we have, not only for the collection, but for the work that you've done for 5 or 6 decades here in the Central Valley. And the world would be a lot better off, and the Central Valley would be a lot better off with more folks like you. And hopefully we can be responsible for training another generation of folks who would bring that same kind of energy, that same kind of love and compassion for the oppressed communities in the Valley that you have shown. So thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for your love, your compassion. And I hope that we can get you on campus soon.
Okay, well, thank you very much.